Crimson splashed across the pale lavender walls like an arterial wound, viscous and malevolent in the filtered afternoon light. It dripped from the soft, sound-dampening panels, pooled on the specially cushioned floor, and smeared across the smooth, rounded edges of the custom-built sensory table. Each drop, each spatter was a desecration. Dr. Evelyn Hayes stood frozen in the doorway, a strangled sound caught in her throat. This was Clara's room, Clara's sanctuary, a meticulously designed, officially registered medical care space, the only place her 9-year-old daughter, who navigated the world through a labyrinth of acute sensory sensitivities, could truly find calm and regulation. Now it was a scene of violation drenched in the aggressive screaming red of cheap exterior paint. The acrid chemical stench burned Evie's nostrils, a stark contrast to the room's usual faint calming scent of chamomile and lavender oils. Beyond the ruined chamber, through the open back door leading to the small fenced yard, stood Karen Miller, their HOA president, a dripping paintbrush in one hand and an almost empty 5-gallon bucket, still sloshing with remnants of the same violent red in the other. A smirk, thin and sharp as a shard of glass, twisted Karen's lips. "There," Karen announced, her voice ringing with a triumphant, almost manic satisfaction that sent a shiver of pure ice down Evie's spine. Much better. That dreary, depressing purple was dragging down the whole neighborhood's aesthetic. A little vibrancy is what this place needed. You should thank me. Evie's world narrowed to the shocking tableau, the violated room, the reek of chemicals, and Karen Miller's utterly uncomprehending hostile gaze. Clara. Where was Clara? A frantic beat of panic. Then a small choked whimper from behind her. Evie turned slowly, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Clara stood in the hallway, her small hand pressed to her mouth, her wide blue eyes, usually so full of a unique, intense observation, now reflecting a horror so profound it stole Evie's breath. The red. For Clara, who processed colors with an almost painful intensity, for whom certain shades could trigger debilitating sensory overload, this wasn't just vandalism, it was an assault. As Evie watched, Clara's body began to tremble, a fine, violent shudder that grew until her knees buckled. A low moan, a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish Evie had not heard since Clara's earliest, most difficult years, tore from her daughter's throat before she crumpled to the floor in a heap, overwhelmed, devastated her safe space, her fortress, against a too loud, too bright, too much world, utterly defiled. The carefully constructed calm Evie cultivated for her demanding role as Chief Investigator for the city's specialized Interior Crimes Division shattered, and for a raw, blinding moment, she was only a mother, witnessing her child's deepest sanctuary being desecrated, her child's fragile peace deliberately annihilated. But then years of training, of meticulously dissecting crime scenes, of facing down perpetrators who believed their actions justified, kicked in. The maternal rage did not vanish. It simply cooled, hardened, sharpened into a lethal focused point. Karen Miller, in her profound ignorance and towering arrogance, had just made the gravest mistake of her life. She had vandalized a registered medical care space, assaulted a disabled child in the most personal way imaginable, and she had done it in front of an expert in precisely this kind of offense. "Clara, baby," Evie whispered, rushing to her daughter, scooping the trembling, sobbing child into her arms. Clara clung to her, burying her face in Evie's shoulder, her small body racked with tremors. The scent of the red paint, invasive and sharp, clung to the air, a constant reminder of the violation. She was making such a fuss about this room, Karen Miller continued, oblivious or indifferent to Clara's distress, her voice grating. Always so secretive. People were starting to talk. What were you hiding in there? Now it's bright, cheerful. No more drabness. The HOA has rules about exterior appeal, and frankly, the mood of a house contributes to that. This is an upgrade. Evie rose slowly. Clara held tight against her. She looked at Karen. Miller truly looked at her with the cold, appraising gaze of an investigator sizing up a suspect. The woman's eyes held a disturbing gleam of self-righteousness, a complete lack of empathy or understanding. "Karen," Evie's voice was deceptively soft, dangerously calm. This room is a designated medically prescribed sensory deprivation and therapy space registered with the city and state health departments as essential for Clara's neurological condition. The materials, the colors, the very air quality are all part of her documented treatment plan. What you have done is not an upgrade. It is felony destruction of a registered medical facility, aggravated vandalism, and willful endangerment of a disabled child. Karen's smirk faltered a flicker of something, surprise annoyance, in her eyes. Don't be so dramatic, Evelyn. Medical facility, it's a spare bedroom you've painted purple. And endangerment. I've brightened her day. She'll get used to it. Kids are adaptable. You will move away from that doorway, Karen. Evie stated, her voice now edged with the unmistakable steel of command. You will put down the paintbrush and the bucket. You will not say another word. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly advise you to use it. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. She shifted Clara gently in her arms, reaching for her phone. I am initiating a crime scene protocol. You are detained. Karen's jaw dropped. Detained. Are you insane? You can't detain me. I'm the HOA president. I was improving community standards. Dispatch, this is Chief Investigator Evelyn Hayes, badge number 101. I am at my residence 4017 Juniper Lane. I have a Class 3 interior crime in progress. Malicious vandalism to a registered pediatric medical care space suspect on site, a juvenile victim requiring immediate medical and psychological support. Requesting immediate uniformed backup, a forensics team specializing in chemical contamination, and an ADA advocate. The suspect is Karen Miller, female 50s, currently attempting to obstruct a crime scene. Evie's voice was clipped professional, a stark contrast to the inferno of emotions raging within her. The quiet, tree-lined street of Willow Creek Estates, with its perfectly manicured lawns and unspoken social codes, had just become the focus of a major investigation, and its self-appointed enforcer was about to discover the full extent of her catastrophic misjudgment. The distant approaching sirens were a counterpoint to Clara's heartbroken sobs, a sound that promised not retribution, but the first difficult step towards restoring a shattered peace. The ensuing hours were a maelstrom of controlled chaos. Uniformed officers secured the perimeter, their presence a stark anomaly in the usually placid suburban landscape. The forensics team, Evie's own colleagues, people she'd trained and led, moved with quiet efficiency, their faces grim, as they documented the extent of the crimson desecration in Clara's sanctuary. They collected paint samples from the walls, the floor, the bucket Karen had wielded, and from Karen's own clothes and hands, bagged the ruined sensory toys, and took hundreds of photographs from every conceivable angle. Evie, after settling a traumatized Clara with a trusted neighbor and a pediatric psychologist who had rushed to the scene, found herself giving her statement the familiar process, feeling alien and raw, now that she was the primary victim, her child the most vulnerable casualty. Karen Miller, after an initial bout of blustering indignation, where she threatened to have Evie fired and sued, had lapsed into a sullen, resentful silence upon the arrival of the uniformed officers and the very serious demeanor of the forensic specialists. She clearly hadn't anticipated this level of official response. The sight of her pristine beige HOA blazer being carefully bagged as evidence because of red paint spatters seemed to momentarily stun her into compliance. She was formally arrested, read her rights again by a uniformed sergeant, and transported to the downtown precinct for processing, leaving behind a neighborhood buzzing with shocked whispers and flashing blue lights. Clara's devastation was profound. The sensory room had been her anchor. It was where she went when the cacophony of the outside world became too much, where her occupational therapist conducted specialized sessions where she learned to regulate her responses to stimuli that would send other children into simple tantrums, but could send Clara into a non-communicative shutdown or a full-blown sensory meltdown lasting hours. The room wasn't just about the pale lavender walls, a color chosen after months of careful trial and error for its calming effect on her specific sensitivities. It was about the specific texture of the floor tiles, the particular weight of the therapy blanket, the dimmable indirect lighting that didn't flicker or hum the silent air filtration system. Every element had been meticulously researched, prescribed, and implemented. To Clara, its violation wasn't just damage to property. It was as if a part of her own mind, her own ability to cope, had been violently ripped away. Dr. Ann Sterling, Clara's long-term neurologist, and the one who had officially certified the room as a medical necessity arrived looking aghast. "Evelyn, this is barbaric," she said, her voice tight with anger as she surveyed the sealed-off room from the hallway. "The level of targeted malice is almost incomprehensible. How is Clara? Overwhelmed, terrified, regressing." Evie said, her voice flat with exhaustion and a grief that felt physical. "She won't speak, won't make eye contact. She's been rocking a self-soothing behavior we haven't seen in years. The psychologist is with her at Marianne's house, but she said..." Evie's voice broke for a moment. "She said this could set Clara back months, even years. All that progress, all that painstaking work." "We will get through this, Evie," Dr. Sterling said, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "Clara is resilient, and you are formidable. I will provide any documentation, any testimony you need. This Karen Miller needs to understand the gravity of what she's done. This isn't just a can of paint." The days that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, insurance claims, and the daunting task of trying to recreate a semblance of normalcy for Clara without her essential safe space. Evie's colleagues at the Interior Crimes Division were incredible, with her deputy Marcus Thorne taking the lead on the official investigation to avoid any conflict of interest, though he consulted with Evie, frequently relying on her unparalleled expertise in such cases. "The evidence against Miller is overwhelming, Evie," Marcus told her during one late-night call. "We have her fingerprints on the bucket, the paint matches samples from her garage. Seems she bought it special for this project. We have multiple neighbors who saw her enter your yard. Her statements at the scene were damning, and the registered medical care space designation is key. This elevates it far beyond simple vandalism. We're looking at significant felony charges. But the legal battle was just one front. The emotional and logistical battles were relentless. Clara couldn't sleep in her own bedroom anymore, as it was too close to the sealed-off therapy room, the faint chemical odor still lingering despite industrial air scrubbers. She moved into Evie's room, but her nights were filled with terrified whimpers and jolting awakenings. Her specialized school program, which relied on her being relatively regulated, became impossible. Her therapists struggled to find alternative locations for her sessions, none of which offered the controlled environment she so desperately needed. Evie watched helpless as her vibrant, curious daughter retreated further into herself, the light in her eyes dimming, replaced by a pervasive anxiety. The Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, stripped of its president, was in disarray. Some board members expressed shock and horror, offering tentative support. Others, clearly Karen Miller loyalists, or simply intimidated by her long reign, were more circumspect, muttering about both sides and neighborhood disagreements getting out of hand. The official HOA stance was one of stunned silence pending legal advice. But Karen Miller, bailed out by her surprisingly wealthy husband, a man who owned a chain of high-end kitchen renovation stores, was far from silent. Though a restraining order prevented her from directly contacting Evie or coming near their property, her influence was a toxic miasma that began to seep through the neighborhood. The first anonymous note appeared in Evie's mailbox a week after the incident, crudely scrawled, "Attention seeker, stop making trouble. Some people like red." Then came the whispers relayed by more sympathetic neighbors. Karen was telling everyone Evie was exaggerating, that the room was just a quirky decorating choice, that Clara was undisciplined, and that Evie was using her fancy job to bully an innocent woman who was only trying to uphold community standards. It was a classic gaslighting campaign designed to isolate Evie and discredit her. The first official HOA notice arrived shortly thereafter, delivered by certified mail. It was a violation warning citing unauthorized structural modifications and ongoing disrepair of an interior room visible from common property, the sealed-off therapy room window, and improper storage of potentially hazardous materials, referring to the forensic seals and containment measures. The notice, signed by the acting HOA vice president, a nervous man named Gerald Tompkins, who had always been firmly under Karen's thumb, demanded immediate remediation to HOA standards within 7 days or face escalating fines. It was so ludicrous, so clearly retaliatory, that Evie almost laughed, if not for the cold knot of anger tightening in her chest. Karen Miller was still pulling the strings, still trying to weaponize the very rules she had so grotesquely flouted. Evie's response was swift and legally precise, drafted with the help of an ADA lawyer Marcus had recommended. She detailed the room's registered status, the ongoing criminal investigation, and cited federal and state laws protecting individuals with disabilities from harassment and discrimination, explicitly naming Karen Miller's actions and the HOA's complicity. She CC'd the city attorney and the State Disability Rights Commission. This was no longer just about a can of paint. This was about her daughter's fundamental right to accessible medical care and a safe living environment. The battle lines were drawn. Karen Miller, far from being cowed, seemed to be digging in her sense of entitlement, apparently unshaken by her arrest. Evie knew this was going to be a long, ugly fight. But as she looked at Clara, who sat listlessly by the window, tracing patterns on the steamy glass, a small lost soul in a world that had suddenly become hostile and unsafe, Evie's resolve hardened into something unbreakable. She would not just seek justice. She would dismantle Karen Miller's reign of suburban tyranny, piece by painstaking piece. Her expertise wasn't just in paint and plaster, but in patterns of behavior in the architecture of malice. And she was about to build a case so airtight, so damning, that not even Karen Miller's wealth or influence could protect her from its consequences. The weeks that followed Karen Miller's arrest and release on bail became a grueling war of attrition. While Marcus Thorne and his team meticulously built the criminal case against Karen for the vandalism of Clara's therapy room, Evie found herself fighting a relentless secondary battle against the insidious campaign of harassment orchestrated by Karen and her remaining acolytes on the HOA board. The official violation notices from the HOA kept coming, each one more absurd and petty than the last. One cited improper window coverings on the sealed therapy room window, which was now covered with opaque plastic sheeting by the forensics team. Another complained about excessive traffic due to the occasional visits from contractors Evie was consulting for the eventual, incredibly complex restoration of the room. Each notice was a deliberate pinprick designed to exhaust and intimidate. Clara's distress continued to be a heavy weight on Evie's soul. The temporary therapy solutions were proving woefully inadequate. One therapist, a specialist in sensory integration, who had been making wonderful progress with Clara, regretfully informed Evie she could no longer hold sessions at their home, citing the unstable and hostile neighborhood environment and her concerns about potential further incidents. This was a devastating blow. Clara's school attendance became sporadic at best. The lack of her regulatory safe space at home meant she was often too overwhelmed to even leave the house. Evie saw her daughter's hard-won communication skills begin to fray her vibrant curiosity, dulled by a pervasive anxiety. The joyous, quirky sounds Clara used to make her unique way of expressing her engagement with the world were now frighteningly rare, replaced by a withdrawn silence that echoed the desolation of her ruined room. Evie's work life, usually a source of intellectual challenge and satisfaction, became another source of stress. As Chief Interior Crimes Investigator, she oversaw a team dealing with everything from art forgery rings operating out of high-end galleries to illegal demolitions of historic landmark interiors. One current case involved a complex network of contractors systematically defrauding elderly homeowners by performing shoddy, overpriced renovations using substandard materials, often leaving the homes structurally unsound. The meticulous work of tracing falsified permits, analyzing doctored invoices, and interviewing traumatized victims required intense focus, a focus that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the situation at home deteriorated. Yet, ironically, the parallels between the professional fraudsters she pursued and Karen Miller's manipulative tactics were not lost on her. Both operated with a profound sense of entitlement, a disregard for the harm they caused, and a belief in their own impunity. One evening, Evie was reviewing financial records from her current fraud case, her eyes gritty with fatigue when Marcus called. "Evie, we got a preliminary lab report back on the paint from Miller's bucket and the samples from her garage. It's a perfect match, of course. But here's something interesting. It's a specialized industrial-grade enamel, not something you typically pick up at the local hardware store for a weekend project. This stuff is designed for heavy-duty exterior use, highly resistant to removal. It's almost as if she chose the most damaging, most difficult to remediate paint she could find." "Now, of course she did," Evie said, a bitter taste in her mouth. "Maximum impact, maximum cruelty." "There's more," Marcus continued. "We subpoenaed her credit card records. She purchased that specific paint along with a set of high-quality brushes and a painter's suit 2 days before the incident. This wasn't a spontaneous act of temper, Evie. This was premeditated. Premeditated. The word hung in the air cold and sharp. This new piece of evidence shifted something for Evie. Karen's act wasn't just born of arrogant ignorance or a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a calculated assault. This realization, while horrifying, also fueled Evie's resolve. She would not be broken. She would not let Clara be broken. The next HOA escalation was more direct. A certified letter arrived informing Evie that due to ongoing and unaddressed violations and the creation of a persistent neighborhood nuisance, the HOA board had scheduled a special executive hearing to consider significant sanctions, including levying the maximum permissible fines and initiating legal proceedings to compel compliance with community covenants, potentially including forced remediation by HOA-appointed contractors at the homeowner's expense. The letter strongly implied that failure to attend or comply would result in a default judgment against her. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. This was Karen's power play, her attempt to use the HOA's quasi-legal authority to crush Evie publicly. Evie knew that Karen would stack the meeting with her supporters, that she would twist the narrative painting herself as the victim, and Evie as the uncooperative troublemaking outsider. But Evie also knew that this meeting, Karen's chosen arena, could also be Karen's undoing. It was time to broaden her own investigation beyond the immediate vandalism. Karen Miller operated with such brazen confidence, such an unshakable belief in her own authority, that Evie began to wonder what other community standards Karen might have been upholding for her own benefit. As Chief Interior Crimes Investigator, Evie had access to a wide range of public records and databases and a keen eye for the subtle tells of financial impropriety and abuse of power. While Marcus focused on the criminal case, Evie decided to do a deep dive into Karen Miller and the Willow Creek Estates HOA's operations. She started with the HOA's publicly available financial disclosures, or rather, the lack thereof. For an organization managing significant homeowner dues and responsible for maintaining common areas and enforcing community standards, their financial reporting was shockingly opaque. Budgets were vague expenditures, often listed under broad, uninformative categories like community upkeep or administrative expenses. Karen Miller, as long-standing president and de facto treasurer, had sole signatory power on most HOA accounts. Evie then cross-referenced property records with vendor contracts the HOA had supposedly issued. She noticed a pattern. A small handful of contractors seemed to receive the vast majority of HOA business, often for routine services like landscaping or minor repairs at rates that seemed significantly inflated compared to industry standards. One company, Miller Prestige Renovations, kept appearing. It was owned by Karen Miller's husband, Arthur. While not illegal on its face for a board member's spouse to do business with the HOA, it required transparent disclosure, competitive bidding processes, and recusal from voting. Procedures for which Evie could find no record in the sparse HOA minutes. This was more than just petty tyranny. This was a potential pattern of self-dealing, of using the HOA as a personal enrichment scheme. The red paint in Clara's room, the relentless harassment. Could it be that Karen's viciousness wasn't just about a dislike for Evie or a desire to control, but about protecting a lucrative racket? If Evie, with her investigator's background and her refusal to be intimidated, started asking too many questions, started demanding transparency, she could threaten Karen's entire system. This was the midpoint twist, the hidden layer beneath the surface of Karen's suburban despotism. The attack on Clara's room, while deeply personal and damaging, might have been a desperate, panicked attempt to silence a perceived threat, to make an example of someone who wouldn't just fall in line. Karen Miller wasn't just a neighborhood bully. She was potentially a white-collar criminal hiding in plain sight, her HOA presidency a shield and a sword. Evie felt a grim satisfaction. This changed the calculus. She now had a powerful new avenue of inquiry, one that could dismantle Karen's power structure from the inside out. She immediately contacted Marcus. "Marcus, I think I've found something on Karen Miller, something bigger than the vandalism, something that might explain her level of aggression." She laid out her findings regarding the HOA financials and the contracts with her husband's company. Marcus whistled softly. Self-dealing, potential embezzlement, bid rigging. If you're right, Evie, this is a whole different ballgame. It moves beyond just punishing her for what she did to Clara's room. It could dismantle her entire power base and potentially lead to much more serious charges. This explains why she's fighting so dirty. she has a lot more to lose than just her reputation as a nosy neighbor. "What do we need to do?" Evie asked. "We need concrete proof to get warrants for her personal and business financials and the full unredacted HOA records," Marcus said. "Your initial findings are a strong starting point. Let my white-collar crime guys take a discreet look. They know how to follow the money without tipping our hand. In the meantime, you prepare for that HOA hearing. Let Karen Miller think she's in control. Let her walk into her own trap." The HOA hearing. Karen's intended stage for Evie's public humiliation was now set to become the arena for a much larger confrontation. Evie, armed with her meticulous documentation of the vandalism, the evidence of its premeditation, the impact on Clara, and now the explosive potential of financial malfeasance, prepared for battle. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was Evie's determination. She wasn't just fighting for her daughter anymore, she was fighting to expose a rot that ran deep within their community, a rot personified by Karen Miller. The atmosphere in the Willow Creek Estates community clubhouse on the night of the special executive hearing was thick with a cloying tension. The room, usually reserved for bland discussions about seasonal planting and holiday decoration committees, was packed. Word had spread like wildfire that this was no ordinary HOA dispute. This was a showdown. Evie walked in a slim briefcase in her hand, her expression composed, her gaze steady. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, a mixture of curiosity, hostility, and a few, she noted, with a flicker of gratitude that held sympathy. Mrs. Albright, an elderly woman from down the street who had always been kind to Clara, gave her a small, encouraging nod. Karen Miller was already seated at the head table, flanked by the other visibly nervous board members. She was dressed in a severe dark suit, her posture rigid, her face a mask of righteous indignation. She surveyed the crowded room with an air of command, as if she were a judge about to pass sentence. The acting vice president, Gerald Tompkins, cleared his throat repeatedly, his Adam's apple bobbing, before finally managing to call the meeting to order. "This special executive hearing has been convened." Gerald began, his voice trembling slightly, as he read from a prepared statement, "to address serious and persistent violations of community covenants and bylaws by the resident of 417 Juniper Lane, Miss Evelyn Hayes. These violations include, but are not limited to, unapproved structural modifications, improper maintenance, and the creation of an ongoing neighborhood nuisance." Karen Miller then took the floor, her voice sharp and carrying. "Thank you, Mr. Tompkins. As you all know, I have dedicated years to maintaining the high standards and property values of Willow Creek Estates. It is a thankless job, but one I undertake with utmost seriousness. Unfortunately, Ms. Hayes has shown a consistent disregard for our community rules and a disturbing unwillingness to cooperate with reasonable requests from the board. Her property has become a source of concern, and her unconventional interior design choices, visible from the exterior, have negatively impacted the aesthetic harmony we all strive for." She went on to list the violations, twisting the facts, omitting any mention of her own actions, painting Evie as an uncooperative and disruptive element. She spoke of strange noises, Clara's occasional vocalizations, unsightly window coverings, the forensic sheeting, and a general air of neglect, the direct result of the vandalism. "Therefore," Karen concluded, her voice ringing with false authority, "the board is here tonight to consider appropriate sanctions. These may include substantial daily fines until all violations are rectified, the mandatory hiring of HOA-approved contractors to bring the property into compliance at Ms. Hayes' expense, and if necessary, further legal action to enforce our covenants." A murmur went through the crowd. This was HOA overreach at its most extreme. Evie stood calm and collected. "Board members, residents of Willow Creek Estates." Her voice, though quiet, filled the suddenly silent room. "My name is Evelyn Hayes. I am a homeowner here, just like most of you. I am also the mother of Clara Hayes, a 9-year-old child with a documented neurological condition that requires specialized medical care in a controlled living environment." She then systematically, fact by devastating fact, dismantled Karen Miller's narrative. She presented large, clear photographs of Clara's therapy room before the vandalism, a calm, beautifully designed space. Then she displayed the forensic photographs of the room after Karen's attack, the crimson paint, the destruction, the chemical warning labels. The visual contrast was stark and horrifying. Gasps rippled through the audience. Evie said, her voice tight with controlled emotion, pointing to the images of the defiled room, is the unconventional interior design choice Ms. Miller refers to. This is the neighborhood nuisance. This is a felony act of vandalism, a targeted destruction of a registered pediatric medical care space, an act perpetrated by Ms. Karen Miller herself, for which she is currently facing multiple criminal charges. Yati. She presented copies of the police report, the restraining order against Karen, the preliminary lab reports confirming the paint match and its industrial nature, and the receipts showing Karen's premeditated purchase of the paint and supplies. This was not a spontaneous act, Evie stated. This was a deliberate, calculated assault on my child's well-being. She then read excerpts from Dr. Sterling's official report detailing the medical necessity of the room and the profound psychological and developmental harm Clara had suffered due to its destruction. Several people in the audience audibly gasped. Mrs. Albright was openly weeping. Karen Miller's face had gone rigid, her eyes glittering with a cold fury, but she said nothing, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The violations the HOA has cited against me, Evie continued, are a direct result of Ms. Miller's criminal actions and the subsequent forensic investigation. To harass me with these notices, to threaten me with fines and forced remediation for damage Ms. Miller herself caused is not only unconscionable, it is illegal. It is witness intimidation and a perversion of the HOA's purpose. She then turned her attention to the broader issue of Karen Miller's stewardship of the HOA. For years, Ms. Miller has ruled this community through intimidation and the arbitrary enforcement of rules. But I believe her motives go far beyond a simple desire for aesthetic harmony. I have conducted my own review of the HOA's financial practices under Ms. Miller's exclusive control as president and treasurer. This was it, the moment the private battle became a public unmasking of something far larger. Evie presented summarized findings, a pattern of non-competitive bids awarded to a select few companies, including one owned by Karen Miller's husband, for services at inflated prices, opaque budgeting, and tens of thousands of dollars in homeowner dues unaccounted for or funneled into slush fund categories with no transparency. I have submitted these findings to the appropriate authorities, Evie stated, and I understand a full forensic audit of the Willow Creek Estates HOA finances under Ms. Miller's tenure is now pending. The room erupted. Accusations and shouts flew from homeowners who now saw their own past grievances with Karen, unexplained fee hikes, arbitrary fines, demands to use specific expensive contractors in a new, sinister light. Gerald Tompkins and the other board members looked pale and terrified, clearly realizing they were presiding over a complete meltdown of their authority and potentially facing their own culpability for negligence. Karen Miller finally snapped. "Lies! These are all lies!" she shrieked, jumping to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "She's a troublemaker, a vindictive outsider trying to destroy our community. I have done nothing wrong. Everything I did was for the good of Willow Creek." "Is that so, Ms. Miller?" A new voice cut through the din. The doors at the back of the clubhouse opened, and Marcus Thorne stepped in, flanked by two uniformed officers and a woman in a sharp suit, carrying a briefcase whom Evie recognized as an assistant district attorney. Karen Miller. Marcus said, his voice calm, but carrying undeniable authority, based on new evidence concerning financial irregularities and potential fraud related to your activities as president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, in addition to the existing charges of aggravated vandalism and endangerment, you are under arrest. As the officers moved forward to handcuff a now white-faced, trembling Karen Miller, the ADA stepped up to the microphone. Furthermore, the ADA announced, "The District Attorney's Office, in conjunction with the State Banking Commission, is hereby freezing all assets of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, pending a full forensic audit and investigation into alleged embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. All current board members will be subpoenaed." The chaos in the room was absolute. Karen Miller was led away, sobbing and protesting her innocence, her reign of petty tyranny and hidden corruption brought to a stunning public end. The remaining board members looked as if they were about to faint. Evie watched it all, a profound weariness settling over her, but also a sliver of grim satisfaction. Justice, in its slow, inexorable way, was beginning to prevail. But the fight, she knew, was far from over. The healing for Clara, for their community, and for herself had only just begun. The downfall of Karen Miller was swift and ignominious. The evidence of financial malfeasance meticulously uncovered by Evie's initial probing and then exhaustively detailed by the forensic accountants was overwhelming. Years of falsified invoices, kickbacks from preferred contractors, including her husband's now bankrupt company, and the outright embezzlement of HOA funds for personal luxuries, lavish vacations, designer clothes, even a down payment on a luxury condo her husband knew nothing about, painted a picture of deeply entrenched corruption. Combined with the airtight case for the premeditated vandalism of Clara's therapy room, Karen Miller faced a mountain of charges. Her bail was revoked due to the new fraud charges and evidence of potential flight risk. Her assets and those of her husband, found to be commingled with illicit funds, were frozen. Arthur Miller, facing his own legal troubles and public disgrace, filed for a quick, acrimonious divorce. The Willow Creek Estates HOA was plunged into chaos, but it was a chaos that held the seeds of cleansing and reform. An emergency interim board was appointed by the state, tasked with cooperating with the investigation and beginning the long, arduous process of rebuilding the community's finances and trust. It was revealed that Karen had plundered nearly $500,000 over a decade, leaving the HOA's reserve funds dangerously depleted. Essential repairs had been neglected, infrastructure was crumbling, and the community faced a daunting financial recovery, likely involving significant special assessments and fee increases for all homeowners for years to come. This revelation predictably led to anger recriminations and bitter divisions among the residents, some of whom, unable or unwilling to face the increased costs, put their homes up for sale, leading to a temporary dip in property values, the very thing Karen Miller had always claimed to be protecting. The road to community healing would be long and fraught with difficulty. For Evie and Clara, the path was equally challenging, but marked by small, vital victories. With Karen Miller incarcerated and her influence removed, the harassment ceased. The new interim HOA board formally apologized to Evie and rescinded all previous violation notices, offering to cover the full cost of restoring Clara's therapy room from whatever funds could eventually be recovered through restitution. Evie, however, knew that process could take years if it yielded anything substantial at all. She decided to proceed with the restoration herself, using a combination of insurance money, which was less than anticipated due to fine print exclusions for intentional acts by known persons, if not court-ordered restitution, and her own savings. She hired a specialized team of contractors and therapists, not just to rebuild the room, but to improve upon it, incorporating new research in sensory design. The process was slow and painstaking. Each material, each color, each fixture had to be reevaluated for its impact on Clara. Clara herself, though still fragile, became an active participant in the redesign. Armed with color swatches and texture samples, she would give a small, almost imperceptible nod for things that felt right and would shrink away from those that didn't. It was a new form of communication, a new way for her to assert control over her environment, and Evie cherished every tiny step forward. The chosen color for the new walls was a soft, mutable seafoam green, a color Clara herself picked, a color that spoke of calm waters and gentle growth. Slowly, painstakingly, the sanctuary was reborn. The acrid scent of red paint was replaced by the clean smell of new, non-toxic materials and the familiar calming hint of chamomile. The day the room was finally complete, Evie held her breath as Clara stepped inside. For a long moment, Clara stood motionless, her eyes taking in every detail. Then she walked to the center of the room, sat down on the new specially weighted floor cushion, and took a deep, shuddering breath. A small smile, the first genuine smile Evie had seen on her daughter's face in months, touched her lips. She reached out and gently took Evie's hand, her touch no longer a desperate cling, but a quiet reassurance. It was not a magical cure, Evie knew that. The trauma of the violation would leave its scars. But in this rebuilt sanctuary, in this act of reclaiming and recreating, there was profound healing. Karen Miller was eventually convicted on multiple felony counts of aggravated vandalism, endangerment of a disabled child, grand larceny, and fraud. Her sentence was substantial: years in state prison, followed by a long period of probation and court-ordered restitution that she would likely be paying for the rest of her life. Her appeals were denied. Life in Willow Creek Estates found a new, more subdued, and more honest equilibrium. The financial struggles continued a constant reminder of Karen's betrayal. But there was also a new sense of shared purpose, a new transparency in the HOA's operations, and a greater appreciation for the vigilance required to maintain a healthy community. Neighbors who had once been isolated by Karen's reign of intimidation began to connect, forming new bonds of support and friendship. Mrs. Albright, the kind elderly woman, became a regular visitor, often bringing Clara small, carefully chosen sensory gifts. A perfectly smooth stone, a softly scented sachet, a beautifully textured piece of silk. Months later, on a cool autumn afternoon, Evie sat in the living room, reading while the soft, melodic hum of Clara's favorite sensory wind chime drifted from the newly restored therapy room. Clara was in there with her occupational therapist, and Evie could hear the faint murmur of their voices interspersed with Clara's own soft, happy vocalizations, sounds that had been silenced for too long. The room was no longer just a medical necessity. It was a testament to resilience, to a mother's fierce love, and to a child's extraordinary courage. Evie thought of the journey, the darkness they had navigated. The victory was not unblemished. The scars on their community and their personal lives were real. But in the quiet strength of her daughter, in the restored harmony of their home, in the hard-won lessons of their community, there was a profound and enduring sense of peace. Justice had been served not just in the conviction of one woman, but in the painstaking, courageous act of rebuilding, of reclaiming, of allowing the light, however filtered and gentle, to enter once more. The crimson had been painted over, replaced by the healing hues of hope. Gone.